The last little bit of scripture for us is the Magnificat, which we've been reflecting on for the entire season of Advent. And we hear these final two verses of her song. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. Let us pray together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts, be pleasing and kind in your sight, our rock and redeemer. Amen. I'm going to take us back to the spring, and it's the week after Easter. And the last few years, I've had the gift of traveling to Bentonville, Arkansas, to gather with other disciple clergy to kind of just have a rest after Holy Week and Easter. And one of my best friends, and is also a minister who's in Odessa, Texas, flew all the way to Kansas City to join us in this event in Bentonville. So he flew to Kansas City, picked him up, and then we drove down to Bentonville together. And in that 3+ hour drive, we did a lot of catching up with one another. One of the things that my friend Joe got to do recently was a sabbatical in his own church setting. And one of the things he did in that sabbatical is he traveled to Norway. And I think, well, that's an interesting choice of where you'd go for a sabbatical. But he did a little work on his family tree and his history. And he didn't know a lot about a few generations past what he knew, past about great-grandparents is about as far as he knew. And then he got into one of those online ancestral websites and started looking in and plugging in the little things that he knew about his family. And he said to me in the car, he said, the coolest thing happened when I was working. I thought, trying to go back and learn about my family history, I thought was going to be really a difficult thing to do. But he said, if you only know 3 or 4 generations back, other family members have already done that work for you. He went back 4 generations, and once he plugged in that 4th generation, that family tree just blossomed back, went back almost 2,000 years of connections of names. And all the other family had done the research before him, allowed him to benefit from that work. And that connection, that work of family tree led him to Norway. His family history led him back to Norway. And because of that deep family tree and the details of that family tree that he was able to connect with on that online site, he got to actually go to the graveyard and see the names of family that were connected to him for many, many generations. You know, family trees are an interesting kind of thing to pay attention to. I myself don't know much past just a few generations. And I'm thankful for some of my family that it was important to them to do more than that. On my mom's side of the family, in my grandparents' house, there was a framed picture of a big giant tree. And if you got up close to the tree, you saw little names in the trunk and the branches as they kind of splintered out and made the tree kind of expand out. You could see little names. And it was basically the history of the family tree. And the part of my family, the Walker name, my son's first name, my middle name, my grandfather's last name, that Walker part of the family tree was kind of way over to the right, down over to the side, kind of the splinter branch over there. But it kind of gave this perspective. We're here amongst this wider expanse of connections to people. Now, my grandmother on my dad's side of the family had all that almost committed to memory. And she would write letters to people. And she was the kind of, talk about that little pin in the hinge. I mean, my grandmother on my father's side, she kind of knew all the connections and how people, and losing her, there was a lot of disconnect because she kept everyone together. And she would talk as though you knew these people. I had one, I guess, 3rd or 4th cousin, Naomi, that lives somewhere in Arizona. And she would talk about Naomi like we were best friends. And the way she talked about family was really fascinating, as though they came alive to you in certain ways. This story of Mary singing her song, she starts the song by talking about, oh my gosh, the same thing has happened to me. And then she begins to reflect in the song of this wonderful God that makes these things happen. And then she begins to sing about this child within her that will bring about justice to the land in ways that people will not be ready for. And then she closes the song by talking about her connection to her ancestors, to the generations that have gone before her and the generations that will follow her. Now, if you look in the New Testament, there are two places where you find genealogies, kind of histories of people, and you have both genealogies are genealogies of Jesus. Now, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but only 2 Gospels have genealogies, Matthew and Luke. And there's only 2 Gospels that have birth stories in them, Matthew and Luke. Now, the interesting thing about these genealogies is that in the Gospel of Matthew, it starts out right at the beginning. A little sidebar is when I got my first Bible, it was a New Testament, little blue New Testament. I was so excited to get my Bible, and I couldn't wait to start reading my Bible from cover to cover. I opened up Matthew chapter 1, and every other word was begat. I got through about 3 verses and said, if this is the Bible, I shut it and said, I'm going to read something else. The idea of going through all these names I didn't understand and couldn't pronounce them and didn't know what was happening, I was like, this is a horrible start to the book. But for Matthew, who was of Jewish background, the author of Matthew was of Jewish background, wanted to make sure that when you started the story of Matthew, that you knew right away that this person of Jesus that we would learn about was connected to this lineage, to David, and all the way back to Abraham. So even before we got any hint of the life of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, any of that stuff, we get this genealogy that helps us understand that this birth that's going to happen is tied to these particular generations and these particular people. And this isn't just some average person that's being born. This is a unique gift that's entering the world that we want to celebrate. So it happens right at the beginning of the gospel. And it goes from Abraham to the birth of Jesus. And then we get the Gospel of Luke, the passage that we've been reading from the last few weeks, this Mary song in chapter 1. And the genealogy doesn't show up till after the baptism of Jesus, which I think is kind of interesting. You think, why is this genealogy in a different location than it was in Matthew? Why is it further in after the baptism of Jesus? And the interesting thing, it kind of goes in reverse. In Matthew's, it starts at the beginning and goes all the way to Jesus. And in Luke's, it starts with Jesus and goes all the way back to Adam, which is kind of interesting. It's interesting how we tell family tree stories. And Luke goes all the way back to Adam. Matthew's concerned about Jewish connections to Jesus and the Jewish tradition. Luke is concerned about social justice and connection to others. And so that this lineage goes back to Adam says it's more than just being connected to the people of Israel. It's all of creation. It's all people are included into this story. And it starts after the baptism of Jesus because it heralds in Jesus' ministry, not just his birth. But then you go back to Matthew's family tree story, and it's interesting that there are uniquely 4 women that are mentioned in the story. You have Tamar and Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, which actually is Bathsheba, and you have Mary. Now, if you kind of trace each of those 4 women, they each have kind of a unique story that unfolds that's maybe not would be considered a traditional story. Knowing that in a male-dominated society, male-written documents that we had 4 females show up in Matthew is a pretty unique piece. And the very story of Ruth is embedded in that genealogy that Pam talked about with us today. That without Ruth and without Tamar, and without the wife of Uriah, without Mary, we would not have the gift of Jesus. And so the stories we tell and the people that we include in the stories become important because each of these women that are shared in this lineage in Matthew weren't necessarily maybe the anticipated lineage that was thought of in the moment, but it's what unfolded and how it took place. Sometimes we think of family trees as our own kind of birth family tree. Jennifer and I, we have two children, and I go back and go to my parents and my grandparents on either side and great-grandparents, we typically think of family tree traced through our bloodline. But I'm here to say that family tree is much bigger than bloodline. And actually, maybe family tree maybe isn't the right metaphor. Maybe the right metaphor is not tree, but web. Maybe it's a unique relational web that ties us all together. Shonda Jha says in her book, Rebel, Despots, and Saints, which is an interesting title for a book, she talks about different kinds of ways we think about our ancestral history. There is familial history. There is cultural history and ancestors. There are what she calls movement ancestors, which I really like that terminology, a movement ancestor. And then spiritual ancestors. That we are not bound simply by blood. We are bound by the connections of relationships that we form throughout our lifetime. And that it's not just this one trunk and we're just connected to those we are connected with by birth. That we are connected to a web of people that shapes who we are and who we become. And when I think of my life as a web of relationships rather than a family tree that comes from one source, when I think of a web, that web kind of spreads out in all different kinds of directions. I begin to think of all the influences that had some kind of impact on my life that helped make me who I am. I think of Ruth in this story. And Ruth wasn't part of the Jewish lineage until she married Naomi's son, and she kind of got grafted into that family. But without Ruth being grafted into the family, we wouldn't have had the narrative and the genealogy the way it's told in the Gospel of Matthew. Without the compassion that she brings to her mother-in-law. Without her willingness to go to a strange land to be by her side, the decisions that people make in the moment impact the web of relationships that we develop in our life. One decision leads us this direction. Another decision leads us a different direction. And the decisions we make impact the relationships we have in our life. I think of cultural ancestors, of teachers and mentors and people that have encouraged me along the way. I think of Kelly Ivy at First Christian Church San Angelo, who came up to me when I was in 5th grade and asked me to co-lead VBS at 5th grade. I still think of her name, Kelly Ivy. It's there imprinted. She's part of the web of my ancestral history. One of my mentors in college was Ken Lawrence, was a professor of religion, art, and architecture. I learned a lot from him. But his wife, CJ, she made things work. And man, could she cook. And she said, I've never seen anybody eat like you do, Chris. Her specialty was spaghetti carbonara, which had the little bit of meat in with the spaghetti. It was just fantastic. And whenever he did a trip abroad, she was all the detail work. Ken did all the flowery lecturing and inspiring, and yet none of that would have happened without CJ taking care of all the logistics, all the work. Whenever a group would travel, she would always linger and kind of be the last in line to make sure everybody was herded together and no one was lost. I was so grateful when my mentor Ken passed away. CJ called me and said, I know y'all were close. I want you to come to his library, and I want you to be able to pick out some books from the library so you can remember him every time you open those books and read them. And this wasn't a blood relationship, but these are relationships that move us and shake us. I think of movement mentors, people that are moving the needle of justice in our society. We have recently established a kind of a new cultivating relationship with Second Baptist Church. And I think of Reverend Dr. Bobby Love at Second Baptist Church and the work he's done in that community, in that church, in Olathe and Greater Kansas City. It's amazing the work he's done just to work with him and work alongside him and see what he knows and how he navigates community and how he navigates justice and he helps the poor and helps the marginalized. He inspires me just by being around him. I think of spiritual mentors and people that have shaped my life in various ways, that have helped enrich the very faith that I have. And then we read the Song of Mary. She's a little bit nervous, I'm guessing. A little bit excited. Anticipating this birth that's about to take place that's a game changer in her life. Traveling to a place, not knowing where they would stay, not knowing what would happen. How is this birth going to happen? Who's going to be with me? How will things work out? All the anxieties of the travel. Who am I, she would say, in this grand scheme of the history of God's unfolding over time? But Mary's place in the story is critically important. The birth that she will have a part of, this child that she will help nurture, the people that have taught her along the way, voices she will have to ignore that will want to put her in her place, the boldness that she will have to live with in a society that's not built for her to have a life of the greatest joy. And yet she finds a way through. She would say in her mind, the history tells me that it's a man's world. What choice, what chance do I have? And then she realizes that she's a part of a bigger story. She's not just part of a family tree. She comes from a family web of people that shape who she becomes. And she says to herself, I have a voice. I have my own strength. I have my own abilities. And I have God's presence to guide me every step of the way. We start looking at our past. We wonder, will I amount to anything when I look back? When we look back at our past, we can look at some of our past and think we can romanticize some of the people that have been in our past. We almost over-exaggerate the influence they have. And there are some that we're embarrassed by some of our past and what some people have done. And there are some that we didn't know enough of, and they're unheralded in the work that made you who you are. So Mary decided, I have this past that is rich and deep. But the future I make is what I do now with the people around me and the life that God invites me to live each and every day. And so we make our web, and we know where those relationships come from. At the same time, we expand our web, and we expand our influence. As much as we look backwards, it only invites us to look forward just as far or further. God's dream of the past is not just about looking back. God's dream of the past is allowing us to see clearly in a moment what was so that we can choose what will be. Mary's story, whether you know it or not, is part of your own spiritual web. A life over 2,000 years ago. If you look deep enough, if you go to Ancestry.com and you plug in enough generations, you might just find Mary in there as part of your own